let's continue 50 Key Video Games, guys. It's the second book I'm reading today. And last stream with this book, we read 3 different games. I think we talked about the Oregon Trail a little bit. We talked Pong, Space Invaders, and Pac-Man. But we're going in chronological order, guys. Let's do Donkey Kong next. I don't know what the heck Zork is. We're going to skip Zork because I want to talk about that. So, Donkey Kong is page 63. Let's talk about a little bit of history of the original Donkey Kong arcade game. And I'm only going to read select. There's like 4 to 5 bullet points, in the paragraph. So, narrative and character in Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong's music, and Donkey Kong Beyond the Arcade. So I want you guys to check this book out. So I'm not going to spoil it all for you. I'm just going to read select readings, but let's start at the beginning. Donkey Kong, 1981, page 63. As the creation myth goes, in the beginning, Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to name his first ever game a challenging 4-level visual and oral extravaganza with unprecedented attention to character and story for an arcade game, Stubborn Gorilla. As frequently happens with creation myths, there are various tellings of the story. In many, the Japanese English dictionary Miyamoto consulted offered up Donkey and Kong as synonyms, and thus began the legend of one of the video game's most iconic characters when the coin-operated arcade game with that cryptic title, Donkey Kong, Nintendo 1981, was released. Nintendo initially planned to make its way into U.S. arcades with a top-down shooter, following in the genre of earlier successes like Space Invaders and Galaxian, called Radar Scope. While Radar Scope was successful in Japan, the early test markets in the U.S. were decidedly underwhelming. Nintendo gambled on an unknown designer, Miyamoto, and a literally game-changing plan to repurpose the underperforming Radar Scope machines into something previously unseen in the video game world. Donkey Kong established not only Nintendo, but also its creator, as major forces within the video game industry. The game introduced several important innovations in game design. It was the first highly successful example of the platform genre, where characters moved an avatar through a computer-animated space while avoiding obstacles, as opposed to firing at descending invaders, like in Space Invaders, or navigating through a maze, as in Pac-Man. The shift in the game's basic action for the player was distinctive, as it introduced the potent activity of rescuing together with what had previously been limited to verbs like shooting and chasing. The player's avatar, initially a carpenter named Jumpman, had no extraordinary abilities, just the capacity to run, jump, and occasionally grab a hammer. Jumpman would get a career and name change, becoming the plumber Mario in the later games. Yet Donkey Kong also stands apart from its fellow quarter-gulping games for offering up more narrative information than was revealed in other arcade video games and for the relative complexity of its musical accompaniment. Let's read one more bullet point because this is pretty interesting. The next subchapter of this is narrative and character in Donkey Kong. The effects at storytelling within Donkey Kong were unprecedented within arcade video games up to its time. In his analysis of Centipede, Richard Rouse III had astutely observed that most early arcade games avoided a story, but instead focused just on establishing a setting. Neither the game nor its paratextual elements, like cabinet illustrations, explain why there were insects dropping down from the top of the screen, nor why the player should try to shoot those insects. And similarly, mysterious settings could be described in Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Frogger, and many others. Donkey Kong uses introductory and inter-level animated sequences, early examples of what would be later be called cinematics or cutscenes, following the inter-level animated shows in Pac-Man, which did not explain anything about the story and only highlighted the playfulness of its characters. to reveal the story where the giant ape, in parentheses, in Miyamoto's imagination, the ape had been owned by Jumpman, has abducted a woman, who is Jumpman's girlfriend, climbed up a ladder, and then jumps with such force that it causes the girders to bend. Jumpman must then run, jump, and climb up the girders to try and rescue the woman. That the woman in the game would eventually be known as Pauline is explained as a homage to the wife of the warehouse manager Polly, who was assisting in the conversion of unsold radar scope machines and Donkey Kong cabinets. That's cool. Intentionally or not, the name Pauline creates a connection to the early 20th century film series, The Perils of Pauline. Ben Singer has written about The Perils of Pauline as the lone surviving vestige of a genre that he labels the serial queen melodrama. These films stressed female independence and mastery, and pointed to the youthful film industry's interest in cultivating a female audience. Indeed, there are important parallels between the early film industry and early video game industry's efforts to create more products with female protagonists, as occurred in 1982 with Miss Pac-Man, a game that, like Donkey Kong, also borrows the visual and musical vocabularies of early cinema. The Pauline of the early film serials was a bold adventurer, making the hapless Pauline of Donkey Kong, whose sole purpose in the game is to cry help. A politically reactionary reconfiguring of what had earlier been a far more active and heroic female character. If we can conceive of Donkey Kong as a nostalgic and even perhaps postmodern reworking of early cinema conventions, it is also relevant to note that the narrative device of the cliffhanger, such a central feature of early serial cinema, finds a modern parallel in the way that games like Donkey Kong lead the player through a level only to discover that the damsel is still in distress and will need saving in the next level. Donkey Kong's postmodern pastiche extends beyond allusions to early cinema and into a landmark early example of Hollywood's adventure and fantasy films. RKO Pictures' King Kong from 1933. One of the most iconic moments from this influential film has Kong, a giant ape, kidnapping a blonde white woman and scaling the heights of the recently completed Empire State Building. Donkey Kong also features a giant ape stealing away with the white woman to the top of a high building, as well as seeming to share the family name from RKO's earlier film. When Donkey Kong began generating massive revenue for Nintendo, Universal Studios lodged an infringement suit against them, citing similarities in the likeness and name of its title characters. Histories of the Nintendo company and Donkey Kong often relay, with no dearth of glee, the poetic irony of Nintendo's lawyer pointing to a 1975 suit of Universal's against RKO, where Universal had successfully argued that King Kong was in the public domain, hence negating their own claims of ownership. RKO's original 1933 film was remade in 1976 by John Guillermin, and perhaps some of the Chinese company Nintendo's fascination with the U.S. figure of King Kong may make sense within the context of a moment when Stuart Hall said that postmodernism, quote, is about how the world dreams itself to be American. So there's Donkey Kong, guys. There's a couple more bullet points, but I'm going to skip them. Don't want to spoil it all for you. Plus reading takes a lot out of me. All right, so up next in chronological order, I'm going to skip Dragon's Lair. I'm going to skip Elite. I'm going to skip King's Quest. Let's go do Tetris. And then after that, let's do Super Mario Brothers. These are going to be good. Let's read some popular ones. So Tetris is on page 148. No, that's King's Quest, 268. All right, bear with me, guys. Let's get over there. Let's read about Tetris. All right, here we go. Oh, I just want to check one thing real quick, dude. All right, here we go. Tetris. There are several key scenes in The Queen's Gambit from 2020 on Netflix where chess prodigy Elizabeth Harmon, played by Anna Taylor-Joy, imagines statuesque pawns, bishops, and knights sweeping across the ceiling, analyzing countless possibilities for games in her head. Harmon is depicted as obsessively fascinated with the elegant movement of the pieces, practicing, refining, and committing strategies to memory. While viewers may not have had this kind of connection to the game of chess, many of them are likely to recall a similar experience with the video game Tetris. Imagining the tetriminos endlessly rotating in midair and falling gently into neat rows behind one's eyelids, after images of hours of compelling play set to the game's captivating musical loops. Tetris is ubiquitous and influential, a household name known to gamers and non-gamers alike. The popularity of this falling block puzzle has been consistently credited to the addictive qualities of its satisfying, challenging, yet irreducibly simple gameplay. The game has sold over 500 million copies according to the official Tetris website, and earned a Guinness World Record for the most ported video game in October 2010, with versions on 65 platforms. However, it was not Alexei Pajitinov's 1984 prototype that catapulted Tetris to the unassailable place in the gaming pantheon, but the versions accompanied by Russian-tinged graphics and music that were commercially released for the NES and the Game Boy in 1989, which allowed a wide range of players to access and experience a sleek, polished version of the original idea. The top 47,858 games of all time podcast, for instance, unequivocally ranked the 1989 Game Boy release as the greatest game of all time. While this argument complicates the notion of the game as a single entity in a volume such as this, Tetris remains remarkably stable in its core game design across various iterations. I would argue that the game owes its continuing cultural resonance and relevance not only to this constancy and sense of timelessness, but also to its added music and graphics, which imparted a distinctive personality to the game and transformed it into a lasting icon. In this brief chapter, I describe not only the ludic merits of Tetris, but also how the music transformed the puzzle game and solidified its status as a transcendent pop cultural icon before situating the game within academic discourse. Alexei Pajitnov developed Tetris on an Electronica 60 terminal in June 1984 while working for the Soviet Academy of Sciences, programming in Pascal in his spare time. The original version had black and white graphics, with the pieces represented by square brackets instead of patterned squares and colors of later iterations, and no sound. However, as Tetris made its way to the United States, it acquired distinctively Soviet graphics and music that exoticized the game for U.S. audiences and added a purported glimpse behind the Iron Curtain. The 1988 release by Spectrum Holobyte was the first to introduce the Russian aesthetic to entice North American players to play the Soviet Challenge. Cool. All right, so let's see. The next bullet point is called From Folk Tune to Fandom. The next one is Perfection in Motion, the gameplay. Let's read this bullet point. Perfection in Motion, the gameplay. The music of Tetris complements gameplay that can be best described as perfection in motion. Matthew Matosis, 2013. The set of 7 different tetromino pieces represents a Goldilocks-esque just right with regard to gameplay complexity, styled in Tetris games as tetraminos to better match the game's title and allow for a trademark on the term. Triominos only have 2 permutations, which lack challenge for the player, whereas the 12 permutations of pentomino shapes would be too complicated to manage well. Further, the gameplay has a universal appeal that does not require mediation from language, narrative, or culture, which also makes it easier for new players to understand quickly. And every player will be challenged by the game at some point as it progresses. Other pieces have used similar descriptions, such as airtight, bulletproof, and impenetrable, to espouse the intuitive perfection of the gameplay and its difficulty curve. Jordan explored the game's mechanics in detail, examining elements such as the algorithms that pseudo-randomly select tetriminos for the player to create a finely tuned difficulty curve, and the introduction of color, sound, and visual interface designed to enhance gameplay cognition. Additionally, part of the game's appeal lies in its constructive impulse, creating lines and tidying up the game space instead of going on a destructive rampage. Stafford frames Tetris in light of the Zeigarnik effect, a phenomenon in which human beings have a better memory of tasks that they have not yet completed or that they were interrupted. Tetris is endlessly incomplete and thus intensely and psychologically absorbing, addictive, and memorable. The next bullet point is Beyond the Game. Kind of gives some history on its selling, but we'll skip that one for now. So that was Tetris, guys. We're going to go to Super Mario Bros, guys. Come on. I'm excited to talk about Super Mario Bros. This is on page 262. Let's go to page 262. All right, let's get some water. Excuse me. All right, let's read Super Mario Bros. From 1985. I'm sure there'll be a lot of good factoids in here. Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. Wasn't the first video game starring Mario, but it is one of the most notable. When it was released in 1985, the console market in North America had collapsed, and many thought video games were just a fad. Excuse me. Sorry. By 1987, the North American console market had rebounded, and Nintendo was in control of 70% of that market. The games released for its console were one of the main reasons why Nintendo was able to capture so much of the market, with Super Mario Bros. Chief among them. In the years since its release, the game has sold more than 40 million copies, due in no small part to its being bundled with the NES starting in 1988. It has been remade and updated several times and had numerous sequels and spin-offs. Among its accolades are being named one of the greatest video games of all time by numerous publications, including Time Magazine and Game Informer. While there are countless reasons why Super Mario Bros. Has had such a lasting impact, some of the biggest are the way the game combined elements from previous games in new ways, the design of the game itself, and the impact on the video game industry. Alright, so the first bullet point is design and gameplay. The next is impact, and there's a conclusion. Let's just go with the next bullet point, which is design and gameplay. While Nintendo ended up releasing cartridge-based games long after, Super Mario Bros. Was meant to be the last cartridge-based game released before switching to floppy disk-based games and a grand culmination of other games. Therefore, Super Mario Bros. Borrowed elements from earlier games like Mario Bros., coin collecting, green pipes, and turtle-like enemies, excite bikes, ability to scroll part of the screen, and Devil Worlds, capability to have characters twice as big as characters in the previous games. However, rather than just taking elements from previous games, Super Mario Bros. Took those elements and combined them in new and unprecedented ways. As Nathan Altice writes, none of the individual aspects of Super Mario Bros. Were revolutionary, but in combination they served as the architectural foundation for tile-based worlds tailored to character-based platforming. Part of what made Super Mario Bros. Stand out was the fact that, rather than static screens like earlier Mario games including Donkey Kong and Mario Bros., Its world seamlessly scrolled as the player moved Mario. In a game such as Pitfall, the character moves across the screen from left to right, while the backgrounds remain stationary. But in Super Mario Bros., the character typically stays in the middle of the screen and the background moves from right to left. This gives the impression that the level is one continuous scene rather than individual sets. Super Mario Bros. Wasn't the first to do this, as other games, such as Defender from 1981, had to continuous scrolling. Nonetheless, it combined this and other technical accomplishments with the personality of Mario, the memorable graphics, and other elements to create something notable. In addition to scrolling backgrounds, Super Mario Bros. Had levels that were alive with their own enemies, environments, and music. Mario's first games, including Donkey Kong and Mario Bros., all took place against black backgrounds. Super Mario Bros. Had multiple locations, each with its own settings. The first level was bright and colorful, with the blue sky in the background and fluffy white clouds. The second level may seem like a throwback with its black background, but this was because it took place underground. Later levels replaced the ground with platforms that seemed to be high up in the sky, or they took place entirely underwater. This variety also extended to the enemies, which came in several shapes and sizes, and with creative names like Koopas, Goombas, Hammer Bros, Bloopers, or Piranha Plants. Each enemy had a different play mechanic for defeating them. Moreover, in Super Mario Bros., Mario had actual facial features and a personality. Games for earlier systems may have had human characters, but they tended to be little more than stick figures. Mario had distinct clothes and a mustache. When he jumped, he raised his arm as if in victory, and a bouncy chime played. These all combined to make Mario seem upbeat and energetic. More than just bouncy sound effects, Super Mario Bros. Had memorable music throughout the game. There were earlier games with music in them, but few had become as iconic as composers Koji Kondo's Super Mario Bros. Soundtrack. The theme song was so well known that when Paul McCartney met Koji Kondo, Paul started singing the overworld background music. This is from an interview by 2010. Each of the 4 environments of the game had its own theme, and yet the entire soundtrack to Super Mario Bros. Is less than 3 minutes long. Despite its overall brevity, the music of the Super Mario Bros. Has been performed by numerous orchestras around the world, has appeared in many subsequent Nintendo games, and has had academic articles and at least one book devoted to it. In addition to these aesthetic elements, the gameplay of Super Mario Bros. Is also engaging and full of secrets and surprises. It is deceptively simple. The player controls Mario, or as a second player, his brother Luigi, and moves him from left to right as he jumps over onto enemies and environmental obstacles, such as chasms, fire, and falling objects, to achieve the final goal of rescuing Princess Peach from the evil King Koopa. The game's controls are limited to just 3 buttons. A plush-shaped one moves the character, a round one makes the character jump, and the second round one makes him jump or throw fireballs. There is also a select and start button, but those are not used while playing the game. If that was all Super Mario Bros. Consisted of, it might have been enough to make the game a hit, but the game also uses these controls in multiple ways to present various challenges and surprises. One of the biggest surprises players encounter for the first time comes at the end of the 4th level. Previous games often had a small number of levels. For example, Donkey Kong had 4 levels that repeated, and Mario Bros. Just had different colored versions of the same level. So it seemed logical that when the player reached the end of the 4th level in Super Mario Bros. And defeats King Koopa, the game would either end or perhaps cycle back to the first level. Instead, the player learns that not only have they not defeated the final boss and that Princess Peach is in another cancel, but also that it was not the end of the game, just the end of the first of the 8 worlds, each with 4 levels. The game is full of many other surprises, such as invisible floating blocks, pathways that could be discovered by breaking bricks, and special pipes that could be entered to reveal bonuses or alternate paths that skipped a section of the level or even warp to other levels. These warp zones also made the game easier to replay because it allowed a player to skip to a later level without having to grind through earlier levels. So if a level was frustrating the player, one quick trip through the warp pipe could skip that level and let the player continue the game. These features rewarded players for exploring and encouraged them to keep replaying the game. In the days before the internet or walkthroughs, these secrets and tricks became a kind of folklore that spread from person to person, largely by word of mouth in magazines. Like traditional folk stories, some of the secrets were exaggerated or totally wrong. Because of this, players could never be sure which secrets or tricks were real, and so they had to replay the game to see for themselves. In this way, an informal network of players who was created who would talk about the game and speculate whether there were still more secrets to discover. This helped the reputation of Super Mario Bros. Grow and kept people thinking about the game. So the next is Impact and Conclusion, and I'll skip those. So I'll just read those 3 games. So we've done 6 games in total. We'll pick this back up next stream, guys. I'll start with The Legend of Zelda. So we'll work through the mid-'80s and go towards the late 80s. So I hope you guys enjoyed that.